Bataan, the Philippines, April 1942. The jungle breathes heavy with smoke and disease. The air is thick with the smell of salt, sweat, and something else, fear. On the narrow strip of land between the mountains and the sea, the last American and Filipino defenders are surrounded. Their rations are gone. Their ammunition is nearly spent. And yet, behind the crumbling front lines, in a collection of makeshift tents and broken cots, one woman is still fighting. Her name is Josephine Nesbit, a U.S. Army nurse, stationed with the Army Nurse Corps in the Philippines. She is not carrying a rifle. Her weapon is a syringe. Her battlefield, a tent filled with groans. You can almost see her in that moment. Her white uniform, now stained brown from blood and mud. Her hands trembling, not from fear, but from exhaustion. Around her, hundreds of wounded men lie shoulder to shoulder. Some whisper prayers. Others stare blankly at the ceiling, waiting for the morphine that will never come. Outside, artillery fire grows closer. Each explosion sends a rain of dirt and leaves through the holes in the tent's roof. The ground shakes, but she does not stop. She moves from one cot to another, pressing cloth to wounds, whispering names to make sure they stay awake. When the shells stop falling, the silence is worse. That is when the screams begin again. They would later call her the Angel of Bataan. But in those days, there was no halo, only sweat and smoke. Josephine and her fellow nurses were trapped in the middle of one of the most desperate battles of World War II. When the Japanese forces surrounded the Bataan Peninsula, the Allied troops, mostly Americans and Filipinos, fought until they could no longer stand. Medical units were ordered to stay behind, to tend to the wounded who could not be evacuated. They were told, "Do your duty, no matter what happens." And so they did. Every day, Josephine watched as the jungle claimed more lives, not only from bullets, but from malaria, dysentery, starvation. They boiled muddy water for drinking, reused bandages, and prayed that quinine would arrive before the fever took another man. When Japanese planes appeared in the sky, they had no anti-aircraft guns, only white sheets painted with red crosses. It didn't matter. The bombs still fell. At night, she wrote in her journal under the dim light of a lantern, her handwriting small, deliberate. "We have nothing left. The wards are full. The men look to us, and we must look strong. But I don't know how much longer we can keep going." Outside, the jungle pulsed with insects. Far in the distance, faint music, an army band still trying to play. Then, silence again. By early April, Bataan was dying. The men were skin and bone. The nurses, ghostly pale, their uniforms reduced to rags. Yet in that ruin, Josephine did something no one ordered her to do. She treated not only her own men, but the enemy. Japanese soldiers wounded in the same battles carried in by Filipino civilians. Her colleagues were stunned. But Josephine only said, "They bleed the same." In the heart of chaos, she made a choice that most could not. A simple, defiant act of humanity, one that would later save her life. When the surrender came, there was no relief. The guns fell silent, but the suffering did not. Thousands of American and Filipino troops began the brutal Bataan Death March. The nurses, Josephine among them, were taken as prisoners of war. They were herded into trucks, sent north to the prison camps. And even there, behind barbed wire and watchtowers, she continued her work. She scrounged for medicine, sewed makeshift uniforms, kept the sick alive with boiled rice water and willpower. For more than 3 years, she endured captivity, not as a soldier, but as a nurse who refused to stop healing, even in chains. Years later, survivors would remember her not for her rank or medals, but for the quiet moments, the sound of her voice reading the names of the wounded. The way she still said, "Good morning," even when the sky was black with ash. And the day she shared her last biscuit with a dying man, Japanese, not American. They called her the Angel of Bataan. But angels, as history often forgets, are born in hell. This is not a story of victories. It is a story of endurance, of a woman who, in the darkest corner of war, refused to surrender her humanity. Her name was Josephine Nesbit, and this is her war. Before the name Bataan became a wound in history, it was a quiet peninsula of palm trees and fishing villages, a place of sunrise over calm water, of mango groves and laughter. The American soldiers stationed there before the war called it paradise. They built baseball fields, swam in the rivers, and sent photos home, smiling, shirtless, unaware that the ground beneath them would soon become one of the most tragic battlegrounds of the Pacific. By 1941, the winds of war had reached the Pacific. Japan's empire was expanding like a tide. China, Manchuria, Indochina, one after another, swallowed by steel and ambition. The United States watched, wary but distant. And yet, in the heart of the Philippines, an archipelago under American control, the stage was already set for disaster. In Manila, General Douglas MacArthur prepared for what he called the defense of the Far East. His plans were grand, his confidence absolute. American air power, he believed, would stop any invasion before it reached the shores. The nurses who served under him, including Lieutenant Josephine Nesbit, believed that too. They came with white uniforms, stethoscopes, and optimism. None of them had seen combat. None of them had yet smelled burning flesh. But on December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, the illusion shattered. The first Japanese bombs fell on Clark Field, where American B-17 bombers sat lined up, gleaming under the tropical sun. Within minutes, they were burning wrecks. Josephine was at Fort Stotzenberg, just miles away. She remembered the sound, not a single explosion, but a constant roar, like the sky tearing open. The earth shook. Then came the cries for stretchers. Within hours, her hospital was filled with charred airmen, their bodies burned beyond recognition. She had never treated burns that severe. She would later write, "The smell of burned flesh clings to your hands. You can wash and wash, but it doesn't leave." The Pacific War had begun. The Japanese landed in northern Luzon, advancing south with speed and precision. Their air superiority was total. Each day, columns of smoke rose along the horizon, bridges, fuel depots, towns. MacArthur's forces fell back, retreating toward Bataan, the last defensive line before the fall of Manila. The roads were jammed with soldiers, trucks, and refugees, women carrying children, farmers with carts full of what little they could save. The air was thick with dust and despair. For the nurses, the retreat was chaos. Hospitals were dismantled and moved inland piece by piece. Beds loaded onto trucks, medicines packed into crates. They worked for days without sleep, their white uniforms now streaked with grime. By the time they reached Bataan, there was no hospital left, only tents, tarps, and what they could salvage. The jungle swallowed them whole. By January 1942, the Battle of Bataan had begun. The defenders, about 76,000 men, half American, half Filipino, stood against a Japanese army of more than 60,000, backed by tanks, aircraft, and endless supplies. On paper, it was hopeless. But they held. For months, they held. Inside the field hospitals, Josephine and the other nurses became known as the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor. They had no rest, no replacements, and almost no medicine. The rations dwindled. First rice, then only watery soup made from carabao meat or foraged plants. Disease became their greatest enemy. Malaria swept through the camps. Dysentery, dengue fever, beriberi, names the nurses learned not from textbooks, but from the faces of the dying. They ran out of morphine. They began to cut bandages from their own clothing. They made splints out of bamboo. Their shoes fell apart. But still, every morning, Josephine tied her hair back, washed her hands in muddy water, and went back to work. She was 25. The soldiers who passed through her ward remembered her quiet authority. She rarely raised her voice, but everyone listened. Lieutenant Nesbit, one survivor recalled, could make a man believe he might live, even when he knew he wouldn't. At night, she and the other nurses took turns writing letters for those who could no longer hold a pen. They promised to mail them when the war was over. Few of those letters ever left Bataan. Outside the medical tents, the situation worsened. By March, the front lines had collapsed into chaos. Soldiers fought on half rations. Many could barely stand. Ammunition was scarce. Men carried empty rifles as decoys. General MacArthur was ordered to leave for Australia. His final words, "I shall return," echoed through the camps like a fading promise. The men of Bataan would be left behind. Josephine knew what that meant. The wounded she tended, the nurses under her command. There would be no rescue, only surrender. Yet even as hope drained away, she refused to let despair take hold. She organized makeshift surgeries, cataloged supplies, kept rosters of patients. "If we fall," she said, "at least we will fall in order." On April 9, 1942, after 3 months of starvation, malaria, and bombardment, Major General Edward King ordered the surrender of Bataan. He wept as he signed the papers. For the defenders, surrender did not mean safety. For the nurses, it meant something worse: captivity under a flag that showed no mercy. When the Japanese entered the camps, Josephine stood with the wounded. She refused to leave them. She saluted the enemy commander and requested permission to continue her medical duties. The officer looked at her, this thin, exhausted woman, standing among hundreds of dying men, and nodded once. In that moment, a line was drawn, not between armies, but between cruelty and compassion. Before the march began, before the camps, before the long years of captivity, there was still a flicker of humanity left on Bataan, and it lived in the hands of a nurse who would not stop healing, even when the world around her stopped caring. Long before Bataan, before the sound of bombs or the smell of burning oil, Josephine Nesbit was a quiet girl from Michigan. She grew up in a small town where winter mornings smelled of coal smoke and the river froze solid by Christmas. Her father was a railroad worker, steady, stern, and proud. Her mother a school teacher who believed that knowledge and kindness were the two forms of courage that mattered most. From an early age, Josephine was drawn to hospitals, to the quiet discipline, the smell of antiseptic, the sense that even small hands could save a life. She trained as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, and when the war in Europe began, she followed the news closely. Paris, Dunkirk, London under fire. She couldn't stand the thought of standing by, so when the U.S. Army called for nurses to serve overseas, she volunteered. Not for glory, not for adventure, but because she believed that being a nurse in wartime was not about choosing sides, it was about not turning away. Her deployment order came in the spring of 1941. Destination, the Philippines. The country sounded exotic, far away. Palm trees, sunshine, a new world. She packed her uniforms carefully, crisp whites, starch still strong from the iron. Her mother cried at the train station, but Josephine smiled and said, "It's only for a year." She would not come home for more than 4. When she arrived in Manila, she was struck by its beauty. Coconut palms swaying along Dewey Boulevard, Spanish-style houses, the harbor glittering under the sun. The nurses lived in barracks near Fort Stotzenburg, laughing in the evenings, dancing with the officers at open-air parties. They were young, optimistic, and unaware of how close the storm was. They called themselves the Lucky 13, the first group of Army nurses stationed in the Philippines that year. They sewed their names into their uniforms, shared letters from home, and took photographs with pilots heading out on routine flights. The war was something distant, somewhere across the Pacific. Then came December, and everything changed. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Philippines became a battlefield overnight. Manila went dark under blackout orders. Roads filled with troops. Air raid sirens wailed through the humid air. The nurses moved into field hospitals on Bataan, setting up in abandoned schools and churches. The transformation was swift. The woman who once polished her shoes until they gleamed now walked barefoot through mud. Her medical instruments rusted in the humidity. Her bedsheets became tourniquets. In her small notebook, she wrote, "No time to be afraid. The wounded never stop. We've stopped counting." Each day, she saw the line between life and death blur. A pilot brought in with his hands burned to the bone. A Filipino soldier clutching a picture of his children. A young American who whispered, "Tell my mother I tried." She learned to move past tears, to focus, to act. That was how she survived. But even in war, small fragments of humanity survived. Josephine kept a small silver locket under her uniform, a gift from her younger sister, engraved with the words, "Come home safe." She would sometimes touch it before each surgery, as if it were a ritual, a small anchor to the world beyond the jungle. Her tentmate, Lieutenant Florence MacDonald, remembered the way Josephine always found something to smile about, even in the worst conditions. She'd hand you a cup of muddy coffee and say, "Here's to civilization." It was that kind of humor, dry, unshaken, that kept the nurses sane. As the Japanese bombardment intensified, the hospital moved deeper into the jungle, to a place known as Little Baguio. It was nothing more than a cluster of tents and bamboo huts carved into the hillside, but it became a sanctuary of sorts. Josephine worked through malaria attacks, through days without food. When the fever hit, she refused to lie down. She wrapped herself in a blanket, gave herself quinine, and went back to her patients. To her, stopping was never an option. The soldiers noticed. They began calling her Ma'am Joe. They trusted her more than their officers. In late March 1942, something changed. Japanese wounded began to appear, brought in secretly by Filipino civilians. Young men, barely older than the Americans they were fighting, their uniforms soaked in blood, their eyes wide with fear. Some nurses hesitated. The Japanese had bombed their hospitals, strafed ambulances marked with red crosses. The anger was real. But Josephine stepped forward. She cleaned their wounds, changed their bandages, and said quietly, "They're human too." Her decision was not popular. Some soldiers refused to look at her while she worked. Others whispered that she was risking her life. But Josephine did not care. She had seen too much suffering to choose who deserved mercy. That act, simple, moral, and dangerous, would become the reason her name would be remembered. A few weeks later, the line collapsed. The hospitals overflowed. The nurses ran out of food, water, and medicine. Josephine's face was pale, her eyes sunken. Yet she still moved with purpose. She gave her last quinine tablet to a dying soldier. When a bomb hit the nearby ward, she dragged 2 men out from the rubble with her bare hands. And when the order to surrender came, she stood before her nurses, exhausted but unbroken. "We'll stay together," she told them. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it as one." Outside, the jungle trembled with gunfire. Inside, a young nurse tied her hair back, picked up her medical bag, and prepared for captivity. In every war, there are those whose courage is loud, measured in victories, medals, or orders shouted across a battlefield. And then there are those whose courage is silent, measured in bandages, whispered prayers, and hands that never stop working. Josephine Nesbit belonged to the latter. She was not a hero in the way the world defines heroes. She was something rarer, someone who chose to remain human when the world around her had forgotten how. April 9th, 1942. The guns of Bataan fell silent. After 3 months of resistance, the peninsula that had held the hopes of the Pacific lay broken, its jungles littered with the dead, its rivers thick with mud and ash. At dawn, a white flag rose above the hill at Mariveles. The sound of surrender is not loud. It's not triumphant. It's the kind of silence that settles deep inside the bones. For the nurses, there was no victory, no relief, only uncertainty. Lieutenant Josephine Nesbit stood outside the field hospital, her uniform in tatters, her boots split open. Around her, hundreds of wounded men waited, some on stretchers, others lying directly on the ground. When she heard that the fighting had stopped, she didn't cheer. She simply said, "Then we stay with the wounded." As the Japanese soldiers marched into the camp, the nurses lined up by the flagpole. They stood at attention, pale but composed, refusing to show fear. A Japanese officer approached, his face unreadable, his uniform immaculate despite the heat. He looked at them for a long moment, then nodded. "You are nurses?" Josephine stepped forward. "Yes, we will continue our duties." The officer hesitated. Then, in halting English, he said, "You, take care, no trouble." It was not permission. It was a warning. Still, she bowed her head and replied, "We will." The able-bodied American and Filipino troops were ordered to march north, to what would later be known as the Bataan Death March. The nurses were spared that journey, but not spared the horror of watching it begin. They stood by the roadside as the columns passed, tens of thousands of gaunt, hollow-eyed men shuffling toward the unknown. Some carried wounded comrades on their backs. Some fell and did not rise again. The guards shouted, struck them with rifle butts. The tropical sun burned down mercilessly. Josephine later recalled that moment as the worst of her life. "They looked like ghosts already," she wrote, "and we could do nothing." She turned away only when one of the men, an American sergeant she had treated weeks earlier, looked up at her and whispered, "Don't let them forget us." When the last prisoner disappeared down the road, the nurses were ordered to pack what they could. They were being moved to a makeshift camp at Cabanatuan, north of Manila. Their convoy of trucks rattled across destroyed bridges and burned villages. The road was lined with wreckage, abandoned tanks, dead horses, shattered helmets. The smell of decay clung to everything. They passed Filipino civilians kneeling by the roadside, praying silently as they went. Some tried to pass food through the truck's slats. The guards shouted them back. By the time they reached Cabanatuan, the sun was setting. The camp had once been a school. Now its classrooms were filled with straw mats, its blackboards scrawled with Japanese orders. The nurses were herded inside, locked behind barbed wire, and counted over and over again. That night, Josephine sat on the floor beside a broken window, staring out at the jungle. There were no lanterns, no guards in sight, only the distant echo of insects. She whispered to the nurse beside her, "We are still alive. That has to mean something." The next morning they were ordered to resume work. The Japanese needed the nurses. Disease was spreading among both prisoners and guards. Medicine was scarce, and the Japanese doctors, few in number, relied on their American captives to keep the camp functioning. And so, under a flag not their own, Josephine and her team became prisoners and healers at the same time. Their hospital was a single room, dim, stifling, infested with flies. The wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, sometimes two to a cot. Their supplies were primitive: boiled rags, bamboo splints, dirty water filtered through cloth. The stench was unbearable. But still, they worked. When the Japanese guards brought in their own wounded, Josephine treated them the same way she treated the Americans. She spoke softly, using gestures when words failed. At first, they watched her suspiciously, but soon, a few began to bow slightly when she passed. Humanity, it seemed, could survive even behind barbed wire. Days blurred into weeks. Food rations shrank, rice mixed with weevils, sometimes a thin broth with bits of seaweed. The nurses' bodies wasted away. Their hair thinned. Their skin turned gray from malnutrition. But they refused to give in to despair. Each morning, Josephine gathered them for roll call. They saluted, straightened their backs, and sang quietly under their breath. Snatches of old American songs, hymns, anything to remember who they were. Sometimes she would stand by the fence at dusk, staring at the horizon. The sunsets in the Philippines were still beautiful, deep orange fading to violet. But every evening, she thought of home. Michigan, the snow, her mother's voice. She promised herself she would see it again. One night, a Japanese officer entered the ward carrying a wounded soldier. The man's arm was shattered, his uniform soaked with blood. The officer demanded that Josephine treat him immediately. She looked at the man on the stretcher, then at the officer's drawn sword. "Put him there," she said calmly. As she worked, the officer watched silently. When she finished dressing the wound, she bowed her head slightly. The officer returned the gesture, an acknowledgement between enemies. That night, one of the guards slipped her a small package of medical supplies: cotton, iodine, a roll of bandage. No explanation. Just a quiet act of mercy. Word spread through the camp. The American nurse who treated Japanese soldiers was being protected in small, secret ways. Months passed. Rain turned the ground into mud. Malaria raged again. Death became routine. Each time a prisoner died, Josephine marked their name in a small notebook she kept hidden beneath her mattress. It wasn't an official record. It was a promise that someone someday would remember them. In early 1943, the nurses were moved again, this time to the Santo Tomas internment camp in Manila. There, more than 4,000 civilian prisoners, Americans, British, Dutch, were crowded into the old university grounds. Food was even scarcer. Disease spread like wildfire. But once again, Josephine organized the chaos. She set up hospital wards, trained civilian volunteers, rationed medicine. To the prisoners, she became a symbol of calm, her presence alone enough to quiet panic. One survivor would later write, "When she walked into a ward, it was as if the light returned. We were starving, filthy, and sick, but she made us believe we could hold on one more day." The war raged outside the fences. They heard the distant rumble of bombers, the thunder of artillery as the Allies began their push to reclaim the Philippines. For the prisoners, it was both hope and fear. Hope that liberation was near. Fear that they would not live to see it. Through it all, Josephine remained steady. Each morning, she whispered the same words to her nurses before they began their rounds. "We keep going, until someone tells us to stop." No one ever did. Behind barbed wire, surrounded by death, starvation, and despair, she fought a different kind of battle. Not for ground, not for victory, but for the smallest, most fragile thing left in war: the will to remain human. By 1944, the war had become a long shadow. The prisoners at Santo Tomas were thin as ghosts, their cheeks hollow, their uniforms reduced to rags. The once lush lawns of the university had turned to dust. The camp smelled of decay and boiled rice water. For Josephine Nesbit, every day felt like walking on the edge between survival and surrender. She had stopped counting the months. Time no longer moved in days but in heartbeats, in the rhythm of the sick breathing around her. The nurses were down to fewer than a dozen now. Some had fallen ill, others too weak to stand. But still, every dawn, Josephine rose and tied her hair back with a piece of twine. She straightened her shoulders, adjusted her badge, and walked into the ward. Her steps had grown slower, her face thinner, but her eyes, those steady gray eyes, remained sharp. The prisoners called her the Angel of Bataan. She hated the nickname, but she understood what it meant. It wasn't about holiness. It was about endurance. One morning, she found Lieutenant Florence MacDonald collapsed beside a cot, her fever raging. Florence had been her closest friend since Bataan. Quick-witted, fierce, the kind of woman who could make a room laugh even when there was no reason to. Now she lay trembling, her skin hot, and her breathing shallow. Josephine knelt beside her, wiping sweat from her brow with a strip of torn sheet. Florence opened her eyes and whispered, "It's just malaria again." "Don't make that face." Josephine forced a smile. "You'll be fine. I'll get you quinine." But there was no quinine left. That night, Josephine sat awake, watching her friend slip in and out of delirium. Around them, the camp slept restlessly, bodies twitching, children whimpering in their dreams, the sound of someone coughing in the dark. When Florence's fever finally broke at dawn, Josephine exhaled as if she had been holding her breath for a week. She didn't cry. She never allowed herself to. Instead, she reached into her pocket and touched the small silver locket she still carried. Her mother's face had faded from the photograph inside, but she could still trace the outline with her fingertip. "Come home safe." The words echoed in her mind, softer each year. There were moments when hope faltered. When the food rations dropped to a handful of rice a day, she felt her knees weaken. When the camp guards grew crueler, taking even the smallest comforts, she sometimes wondered if Mercy had simply died. But each time despair crept in, something small pulled her back. Once, a child prisoner, a boy no older than 7, brought her a single wildflower he'd found growing near the fence. He said, "For you, Miss Joe. You make the bad dreams go away." She kept that flower pressed in her notebook for months until it crumbled to dust. It reminded her that even in the filth and fear, beauty could still exist. As the months dragged on, whispers began to circulate through the camp. The Japanese were losing ground. The Americans were coming back. At first, no one dared believe it. They had been disappointed too many times before. But in early 1945, the sound of distant artillery confirmed it, the thunder of liberation. Hope, that fragile, dangerous thing, flickered alive. Josephine tried to contain it. "Don't count on rumors," she told the others. "We survive first. Then we hope." But inside, her heart began to race again after years of numbness. One evening, she stood at the edge of the compound as the sun bled red across the Manila sky. The air smelled of smoke and salt from the bay. She could hear faint explosions far away, closer each day. Florence came to stand beside her. "Do you think they'll find us?" she asked. Josephine's voice was calm. "Yes, they will. And when they do, we'll still be nurses." Florence smiled weakly. "You're impossible." Josephine looked out at the horizon. "No, just stubborn." On February 3rd, 1945, just after nightfall, the first gunfire erupted near the northern fence. The prisoners froze. Then, through the darkness, came a sound none of them dared to dream of. American voices shouting orders, the crack of rifles, the hum of tanks. It was real. Liberation. Chaos followed. Gunfire, shouts, people crying, rushing into the open. Josephine ran to the hospital tent, where her patients lay too weak to move. "Stay down," she shouted. "Help is here." The fighting lasted only hours, but to them it felt like forever. When the dust settled and American soldiers entered the camp gates, Josephine stood perfectly still, unable to move. A young private approached her. "Ma'am, we're here to take you home." She looked at him, dazed, and whispered, "Home." Then, for the first time in years, she allowed herself to cry. Later, when the Red Cross planes lifted the nurses from the Philippines, Josephine sat by the window of the transport ship, watching the coastline shrink into the mist. She had survived, barely. 80 pounds, scarred by malaria and exhaustion, but alive. Florence sat beside her, their hands clasped tightly. Neither spoke for a long time. Then Josephine said softly, "We did our duty." Florence replied, "No, Joe, you did more than that. You made us remember who we were." When she returned to America, reporters wanted stories of heroism, of glory. Josephine gave them none. She spoke only of her fellow nurses, of the men they'd tended, of the ones who didn't come home. She never married, never sought fame. She worked quietly in veterans' hospitals, caring for others until the end of her days. Her medals gathered dust in a drawer. But those who had lived because of her never forgot. History often remembers generals and battles, but sometimes the truest courage is found not in the taking of life, but in the stubborn, endless act of saving it. Josephine Nesbit, the nurse who treated enemies, the prisoner who kept her humanity, the angel who never wanted wings. When the war ended, the world erupted in noise, bells, sirens, parades. But for Josephine Nesbit, the silence was louder. She returned to America in the spring of 1945, stepping off a hospital ship in San Francisco Harbor. The dock was crowded. Reporters, families, military brass. The women in white uniforms looked fragile, their faces pale under the California sun, their eyes hollow but alert. Someone shouted, "The Angels of Bataan have come home!" The crowd cheered, waving flags and flowers. Flashbulbs burst. The band struck up "Stars and Stripes Forever." Josephine flinched at the noise. She hadn't heard a band in 3 years. The sound of music felt like an intrusion, too clean, too bright. She smiled politely for the cameras, but inside her mind was still half in the jungle, the damp earth, the smell of ether, the endless sound of coughing in the dark. They sent her to a convalescent hospital near San Diego for rest. Doctors told her to recover, as if recovery were a place she could simply travel to. But how does one recover from captivity? From burying patients with her bare hands? From hearing the word surrender and knowing it would define you for life? At night, she woke up gasping, convinced she could hear the drone of planes again. She'd reach for her locket in the dark, whispering, "We made it, Mama. We came home." And yet, even in the safety of clean sheets and warm food, part of her felt guilty for surviving when so many hadn't. The Army called her to Washington, D.C. that summer. She and the remaining nurses of Bataan and Corregidor were awarded the Bronze Star for heroic and meritorious service. In the crowded hall, generals in pressed uniforms stood beside women who had spent 3 years in rags. When Josephine's name was called, she stepped forward slowly, her body still frail. A general pinned the medal to her chest and whispered, "You've done your country proud." She nodded. "We did our duty, sir." Later, as the reporters gathered around, one asked, "Lieutenant Nesbit, how did you keep your faith through all of that?" She paused, thinking. Then she said, "Faith is easy when you have freedom. It's harder when all you have is hunger and fear. But even then, you can choose to be kind. And maybe that's faith enough." Her answer made the papers the next morning. But by then, the world had already moved on. To victory stories, to rebuilding, to the atomic age. The Angels of Bataan faded quietly into history's margins. Josephine didn't return to her hometown. Too many questions waited there. Too much curiosity she couldn't face. Instead, she took a job at a veterans hospital in Chicago. The wards there were full of young men with missing limbs, haunted eyes, and letters they couldn't bring themselves to send. To them, she was just Miss Joe, the calm nurse who always seemed to know what to say. When a soldier woke screaming from a nightmare, she sat beside him until he fell asleep again. When another broke down while learning to walk on prosthetic legs, she reminded him softly, "You already survived the hardest part." Her hands never stopped working. Every year on April 9th, the anniversary of Bataan's fall, Josephine lit a candle by her window. Not for the battles, not for victory, but for the men and women who had not made it out. She kept a small wooden box under her bed with a few precious things, a piece of barbed wire from Santo Tomas, a faded photograph of Florence, and that silver locket, its hinge worn smooth. Inside it now were 2 photographs, her mother, and a group of nurses standing in the jungle, smiling for a camera that no longer existed. In 1953, she was invited to speak at a nursing school graduation. She didn't want to go at first, but Florence, still her dearest friend, insisted. When she walked onto the stage, the students stood and applauded. She waited for the noise to fade, then spoke softly into the microphone. "You will learn about medicine, about science, about discipline. But in the end, nursing is not about any of those. It's about remembering that every patient, every single one, is someone's child, someone's love, someone's whole world. And if you ever have to choose between following orders and showing mercy, choose mercy. Every time." The room was silent when she finished. Then, one by one, the graduates rose to their feet again, not cheering, just standing, as if in reverence. As the years passed, her story began to resurface. Historians wrote about the Angels of Bataan, the first American military nurses taken prisoner by an enemy force. Survivors spoke of how Josephine kept them alive not just with medicine, but with hope. But Josephine never liked the attention. When a journalist once called her a hero, she shook her head. Heroes are people who have a choice. We didn't have one. We just kept going because someone had to. When she died in 1974, at the age of 63, her funeral was small. Just a few nurses, a handful of veterans, and Florence, who placed the silver locket in her hands before the casket closed. At the ceremony, a chaplain read from her wartime notebook, one of the few relics she had kept. "We are tired, hungry, afraid, but still we work. I think sometimes that mercy is the only thing left that's ours. If I can keep that, just that, I'll know I didn't lose myself." In the great machinery of war, names like Josephine's rarely make the headlines. But if courage has a truer form, quiet, unwavering, without witness, it was hers. She did not win battles. She did not command armies. But she healed enemies, comforted the dying, and carried humanity across the ruins of empire. That is a victory that never fades. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the maps were redrawn. Empires crumbled, new flags rose, and the world congratulated itself for surviving. But survival, as Josephine Nesbit knew, was not victory. It was a kind of lingering, a quiet existence in the echo of what could not be forgotten. Across the Pacific, the Philippines bore the scars of what history would call the Battle of Bataan, but what the locals remembered simply as the long suffering. Cities reduced to ash, forests filled with rusted helmets and the bones of the nameless. For years after, farmers still found remnants in the soil, dog tags, syringes, buttons, the hollow shape of a canteen, and among them perhaps a faded Red Cross patch, once sewn onto the sleeve of a young woman who had refused to stop healing, even when surrounded by death. When Josephine's war ended, another began inside her. The doctors called it battle fatigue. Today, we might call it trauma. But she never used those words. She simply said, "Some sounds stay with you." Thunder reminded her of bombs. The smell of disinfectant could transport her back to that prison ward in Santo Tomas. And whenever she heard the high whine of a plane overhead, her hands would instinctively clench, as if reaching for a stretcher that wasn't there. The war had ended. But inside her, the alarms never fully stopped. For years, she lived quietly, tending to others, as she always had. There were no medals on her walls, no uniforms hanging in closets, only a shelf of worn books, anatomy, poetry, and a Bible with water stains on its pages. She spoke little of her time in captivity. When young nurses asked about Bataan, she would pause, her eyes distant, and say, "Remember that a nurse's job is not to ask who deserves care, only who needs it." Then she would smile faintly and change the subject. In 1948, the U.S. Army formally recognized the service of the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor. Each woman received back pay for the years lost in captivity. For many, it was a token gesture, a bureaucratic way of saying, "We remember you, but not enough to understand you." By then, most had already returned to civilian life, married, or continued nursing. They had built new lives on top of old wounds, like cities rebuilt on ruins. But in letters exchanged among them, carefully folded, written in tidy cursive, the memories persisted. "I still dream of the river at Bataan. I can smell the ether when it rains. Do you remember the night we thought they would kill us? How we sang instead." They signed their names, simply. Flo, Joe, May, Ruth, ordinary women, extraordinary survivors. By the 1960s, few spoke of Bataan anymore. The world was deep into another war, another generation's tragedy. The stories of the nurses were archived, filed under Medical Corps Pacific Theater. But for the soldiers who had once lain on her operating table, those who had watched her walk between rows of stretchers, lantern in hand, her memory remained alive. They spoke of her at reunions, in veterans' halls, in the quiet spaces between drinks. She was small, but she could lift a man twice her size. She patched me up with nothing but salt water and courage. We called her the Angel of Bataan, but she never wanted the title. One of them, a survivor of the Death March, would later write in his memoir, "When I was taken prisoner, I stopped believing in God. But when I saw what those nurses endured, how they still treated the enemy, how they shared their last scraps of food with dying men, I began to think that maybe God hadn't left us after all. He had just taken another form." Decades later, when filmmakers and historians rediscovered her name, they tried to reconstruct her story. But there were no diaries, no dramatic last words, only fragments. A report from the War Department, a photo in a Manila newspaper, a hospital log signed Latoine Josephine Nesbit, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, 1942. That was her legacy, not in words, but in lives saved, in wounds closed, in the quiet proof that even in captivity, compassion can endure. And yet, in the vast machinery of history, stories like hers rarely hold the spotlight. The textbooks prefer the battles, Midway, Normandy, Iwo Jima. They remember the generals, the victories, the flags raised on mountaintops. But behind those victories were hands like hers, trembling, steady, unseen. Hands that wiped blood, closed eyes, held the dying until their last breath. In every war, there are those who destroy, and those who hold the line of humanity, one life at a time. Josephine was one of the latter. And though her name may fade from the records, her mercy still lingers, like the faint echo of a hymn heard across a battlefield, long after the guns go silent. When the sun sets over the Bataan Peninsula today, it falls upon a small memorial by the road, a stone marker with a red cross engraved upon it. Beneath it are the names of the army nurses who served there. Among them, Josephine Nesbit. Visitors still leave flowers, sometimes a nurse's cap, sometimes a folded note that simply reads, "Thank you." Because in the end, wars end, empires fall. But compassion, that fragile, defiant act of mercy, endures. And somewhere, perhaps, the Angel of Bataan still walks among the wounded, still reaching out her hand in the dark, still whispering the words she once said to every man who trembled before death. "You're safe now. It's over. I'm here." There are wars that end with treaties, and there are wars that never end, the kind that live quietly in the hearts of those who survived. Josephine Nesbit's war ended in 1945, but the echo of her choices, to heal instead of hate, to serve instead of surrender, continues long after her name has faded from the headlines. In the cold logic of history, her story might seem small. She did not raise a flag on Mount Suribachi. She did not lead a battalion through enemy lines. She was a nurse, a figure of mercy in a world built on destruction. And yet, that is precisely why her story endures. Because war is not remembered by maps or medals alone. It is remembered by the people who, amid ruin, refuse to lose their humanity. If you stand today beneath the palms of Bataan, the air still carries the memory of fire and rain. The ground is rich, alive again. Children run where soldiers once fell. But if you listen, truly listen, you might still hear it. The faint rustle of white cloth in the wind, the quiet voice of a woman saying, "Hold on, just a little longer." It is not the voice of a hero. It is the voice of someone who chose compassion when the world demanded cruelty. That choice, repeated thousands of times in hidden corners of history, is what has kept our world human. Every era has its angels of Bataan, those who work unseen, who bind the wounds others create. They are not found in statues or textbooks. You find them in the silence between gunfire, in the hospital tents, in the trembling hands that reach out, not to strike, but to save. War reveals many kinds of courage, but the rarest is the courage to remain kind. In one of her last recorded interviews, Josephine said something simple, almost whispered, as if to herself. "We did what anyone should do. We were there to keep people alive, even if they wore a different uniform. That's all there is to it." Then she smiled, a small tired smile, and added, If that's all history remembers, it's enough. Those words are not carved in stone, but perhaps they should be, because history often celebrates those who destroy, but rarely those who mend. It remembers the victors, not the healers, and yet, without them, there would be nothing left worth winning. Josephine Nesbit's story is not one of glory, but of grace, a reminder that, even in the darkest hours, mercy can still take root. When bombs fall and nations fracture, there will always be someone like her, standing amid the smoke, hands trembling but steady, whispering to the broken, "You're safe now. I'm here." War will always test what we are willing to destroy, but it will also reveal what we are still capable of saving.